Hello and welcome. Today we're going to take a look at why so many cruisers are switching over to lithium and why they're spending so much money to do that. Didn't the old way always work? When we talk about the old way, sometimes I think it helps to take a remember the old house you might have grown up in. It was great. It did the job well. We had like one outlet in every room, and after a while, our needs grew, and we had to add more and more outlets just to accommodate things. So later on, newer codes were made so that you had an outlet every 6 feet. And in our case, Paquita's 2002, and she was probably state of the art back then, but many things have changed, and so as different owners own Paquita, they did different things to try to keep her up, upgraded and with the times. And we did the same. And you say, so why would you do that? What has changed so much? It's still the same hull. Why would you need this? Well, there's some things that people need, and some things that people want, and we're no exception for that. Back when Paquita was made, it didn't seem like anybody would ever have a battery bank big enough to run air conditioning, at anchor or without the generator or being tied into the shore power. But those days are over. With lithium now, Paquita can run air conditioning all night. It's also nice to have little comforts at home too. Like making coffee the way we make it at home. We see a lot of cruisers having air fryers on boat. So we even have a induction cooktop, and this is really for for in case we run out of propane, we have another way to cook. But that's nice as well. Although making bread is something that many cruisers do, and we used to do it by hand, having a bread machine makes things so much easier and really helps with morale too, especially when it's cold and you can go and get the bread going, put something in there, and then 3 hours later when you're freezing cold, you come down off a watch and oh, that's wonderful. The same can be said about the luxury of having an ice maker. I know it sounds strange. We always used to keep ice in the freezer, but that kind of uses up freezer space for that. These ice machines can make ice so quickly that when we pull into an anchorage, we flip that thing on. By the time the anchor's set and everything's shut down, we got the boat stowed away, our drinks are cold, so it's wonderful. But, you want the drinks cold, but you want your shower hot. And if you're spending a lot of time at anchor like we do, sometimes you got to run the generator to heat up the hot water or run your main so that the coolant loop goes through and heats up the hot water. Well, it'd be nice if you had excess power that you might just dump that excess power into the hot water heater. We've been able to do that with this new system as well. Now, Starlink is something that everybody's talking about, and I remember when we first got it, thought that we were so special, and then it seems like every boat today has it. Well, Starlink is wonderful, but it does come with a hefty cost, and I don't mean the price of the thing. I'm saying cost in energy. It takes a ton of power. We'll talk more about that later. But having this kind of power on board with this kind of inverter, you can leave the inverter on all the time, so the boat is always having 110, and that helps out if you have, if somebody uses a CPAP machine or whatever it is, they don't have to ask you to turn the inverter on. It's always on. We've also been able to use a washing machine on board, so now we don't have to go away to do washing. And although we have a lot of water storage when we were down in the Bahamas, we really wish we had a water maker, and now we have one, but that's also something that takes power as well. And so all these things add up, and then, one that we always kind of forget about because we say, oh, it's a little bit here and a little bit there, but all these things, they call them vampire loads. These things actually use up a lot of power over time, and having the inverter on, you're able to have your laptop charged, you're able to have your tablets charged, you're able to have your phones charged, all of that sort of stuff. And so that's something that's really kind of fun and good, but it requires a big battery bank to do that. So let's talk about that. In order to get a good idea of how everything works, we need to go back to when Paquita was brand new. She originally came with 4 batteries, about 100 amp hours lead acid a piece, giving about 200 usable amp hours. Had an 80 amp stock alternator with a V-belt and a dumb regulator, and about 1,000 watt square wave inverter. And then with her next series of refits, she got 6 AGM batteries. Once again, they're still probably about 300 amp hours of usable power. But she got a big upgrade in the way of a 170 amp alternator with a serpentine belt kit and an external smart regulator. That was a kind of a really big one, so that was awesome. She also got a Fisher Panda genset. And unfortunately, that didn't last long enough for me to enjoy it. But then we get to the things that we've done to the boat, and that list is something that I'm really proud of. It's something that you'll start to see here. We got 3 big lithium batteries at 300 amp hours apiece, and being lithium, that gives us about 900 usable amp hours altogether, because you can take them down to 0 depth of discharge. I put a 3,000 watt pure sine wave Victron inverter. It also has a 2 kW charger in it, and we swapped out that Fisher Panda for a 5 kW Northern Lights generator, 1,100 watts of solar, and a Victron battery monitor and communication hub. So, when you think about consumption, you really have to, or when you build a system, you really should talk about consumption, because that really should drive how big your battery is. You just shouldn't just throw money at a problem. You should really kind of have a plan. And so you say, well, how many batteries do I need? Well, how much power do you consume? And so that's something that I put a lot of time into figuring out. And right now, it looks like we use between 150 and 200 watts per hour. That comes out to about 3.6 to 4.8 kilowatts of power per 24-hour period. And that's sitting at anchor or, in a mooring or something like that. But when we go sailing, it's a different story. And of course, this would kind of make sense because, there's things that your loads are going to be bigger, and you're going to have less production from your sails because the boat's heeled over and that sort of stuff. But usually when we're sailing with all the other things like the autopilot and the nav gear and all that sort of stuff that's all running, we're burning about 200 to 250 watts per hour, or about 4.8 to 6 kW per day. So you could see that while we're moving, and if the engine's on, this is not a big deal at all. But as far as the solar production goes, that can be an issue. So in talking about production, we have 3 ways of doing things. I told you we put 1,100 watts of solar on. We have a 170 amp alternator, and we have a 120 amp that we can charge from our Victron Multiplus. And we can do that whether we're plugged in or we run through our Northern Lights generator. When it comes to storage, we have 900 amp hours, or basically if you do 90% depth of discharge, about 11.3 kilowatts of storage. That kind of works out that if we're anchored and we had no input, in other words, no sun at all, we could still, it would be normal to be able to use the battery bank between 56 and 75 hours, or 2.3 to 3.1 days. And that's assuming that we're anchored, and like I say, we don't run the generator and nothing's coming in from the solar panels, and we don't run the main engine. And then with the same assumption, if we were sailing, obviously our loads would be greater because of all the nav gear and autopilot and such. So that would be about 45 hours, or 1.9 days of sailing, and once again with no inputs. So hopefully we're going to get some power if we're sailing just from solar alone. So when we look at what we changed then versus now, we've increased our storage from about 300 usable amp hours to 900 amp hours, and that seems great, but to tell you the truth, our consumption has gone up at about the same rate. So that almost stays equal, just that our way of living has hopefully gotten better. But the big thing is that the generation has increased with lithium, and that's something that people I don't think talk enough about. With a regular lead-acid battery, you usually have 4 stages of charging, and even if you have a big alternator or a big charger, when you get up to about 84, 86%, it's going to start going into absorption, and all that 180, 200 amp charger or whatever is going to be reduced right down to, just basically a trickle. And that can go for 12, 18 hours and you never get them fully charged. And that's something that lithium's really good at. It bulks until it doesn't bulk anymore, and then it just shuts off. And that comes up into another problem that scares people, but we'll talk about how we deal with that in just a second. So I hear you saying, Tim, what does it all mean? All these numbers, what does that really mean in terms we can use? Well, it means basically we can live our luxurious life at anchor if the sun is shining almost indefinitely. I mean, I say almost, as long as the sun is shining, regular days, we're good. But it also means that if we are sailing and we have regular days, days that aren't perfectly sunny and the boat is heeled over and some of the panels don't get all the sun, we can still sail for about 50 hours straight with everything running and all the nav gear. So that's what that means. So how fast can we charge things up? Well, assuming that we only have, a day's worth of use on the batteries and they come down to a state of charge of about 50%, 1 day of charging in the sun, if it's a good day of sun, should charge them right back to 100%. If you're going to be motoring in and out of an anchorage or you have to motor upwind somewhere, 2 to 3 hours of running the main will charge batteries from 50% all the way up, and meaning a battery bank our size, obviously. Or if you're stuck at the anchorage and it's been raining and you need to run that generator, and you can about 2 or 3 hours worth of generator and you'll get the battery bank fully charged up. Now, there are a number of things we can do to reduce our consumption, and we'd want to do this if we were sailing offshore and, if we're going across the Atlantic, across the South Pacific, where you don't want to have to be running the engine, or maybe the engine doesn't work, or maybe you're running low on fuel, or you just don't want to hear it. So, a number of things that we can do to lengthen the time before charging include shutting off the Starlink, shutting off the inverter, not making water, bread, or ice, and reducing the time we use our autopilot or radar. And, just so that you know what we're talking about, by not using the inverter and the Starlink, we can sail using all the nav gear for 5.5 days straight without having to charge again. We get our power in 3 main ways. With solar charging, we have 5 different solar panels, and each one has its own MPPT charge controller. And we do this so that if one gets shaded, it doesn't knock out the other. And it's also good to have redundancy. So if we're offshore and we lose one, we still have other ones that work. Our second means of charging is with the alternator when we run the main engine. And as I said before, the Paquita received a serious upgrade with this Balmar 170 amp alternator. Now, it's a small case alternator, and they're prone to overheat, and you can't do it with a V-belt because there's too much resistance there. It needs the surface area of a serpentine belt. So that had to go if you're thinking of putting one of those on. But one of the ways one of the things great about putting an external regulator on is that you can start to protect the battery as far as you can tell it when you need it to do what. You can also protect the belt. In other words, with this, it doesn't just when the batteries are calling for power and you start your engine, it doesn't just stall the engine out. You can have it slowly, warm up the engine, get the oil circulating for 30 seconds, maybe even 90 seconds, whatever you prefer. And then you can have it ramp up and slowly start at like 5 amps and work its way up to whatever you want. And that's really cool. But the big thing, too, is that it has a temperature sensor. So I have mine set so that when the temperature starts to get to the upper limits of the safe operating limits of the alternator, it starts backing the production down. And that became a big issue in Paquita's small engine room. So we ended up having to put a blower in so that I have it set up so that when the ignition is on, this blower starts putting fresh cold air from the lazarette and blowing right into the intake side of the alternator. And if this is something you should just be aware that unlike an automotive alternator, most marine alternators pull air in from the back and push it out the front, and it goes the other way for a car. So just to have that in the back of your mind.
While we're talking about this, it kind of makes sense for me to make sure that if you guys, I'm sure all of you guys know this, but just in case you don't, whether you have lithium or not, but especially with lithium, because there's so little resistance in a lithium bank that it wants to take everything that the alternator will give it to it, even when it's idling. The problem with that is that if you start up your boat and you're idling it and you don't set the parameters in your external regulator right, the alternator will be called to give it 170 amps, or the best it can do with the RPM that is available, and at idle it's very slow. The problem is that it cools with a fan, so that the faster the alternator turns, the more air comes through it. So if you're asking it to do 100% when it's only doing it 5% of the RPM that it's going to be, you're going to overheat it quickly. So just be aware of that. So when you're running it slowly, you could be heating up the alternator faster than you normally would. So just keep that in the back of your mind. And like I say, those are all things that you can fix with an external regulator and temperature sender. And the last way we can charge things is through our Multiplus inverter charger. And we could do this whether we're plugged in, with shore power, which we hardly ever are, or if we run our generator. And Victron, this used to be, I used to say how great this was that Victron does it, but I think, to tell you the truth, I think all the new inverters are doing this, but they have things on them that are really cool, like load sharing. So in other words, if your generator or your line, your shore power is being asked to do more than it can, the inverter will actually pull power off the battery bank to supplement like a startup load of a compressor or something like that. Those are really kind of cool things, but very cool, hardly ever used on our boat anyway. But they also have some great things, and that's that you can go in and it's not just like a box you plug in. You can go in and totally change the parameters of everything in here. And this has really worked well for us, because when I'm running the generator, I want to put as much excess power as I can into the batteries. So you can set it up so that your generator produces this much and anything else goes into the battery, and if something comes on, it just knocks that back so it will never go over there, and it keeps you from tripping out, which is something that I think is really, really cool and really, really helpful when you're charging batteries at, in this case, 120 amps, which is a considerable amount to charge them, but it's a big bank, and Lithium loves to take it when you juice them right up. And then we come to my favorite part, the Victron Suite. In the commercial world, I'm a big believer that when you set up a wheelhouse, ideally you don't want to have a whole bunch of different competing systems. It's kind of nice when you have one system that runs the entire length of the wheelhouse or NEMA backbone. And in this case, with all the electrical components, I wanted everything to talk to it on the same network, on the same language, and I did everything in Victron. And we started out with the Victron battery monitor, and this will tell you not only percentages and volt, because the old days of measuring a battery by voltage, because lithium, the volts don't change too much until it's gone. You can't really get a good idea for how much power is in there. So what you do is you top it off when it's full, and you measure it, and then you top it, and then you measure it again when it's empty, and then it figures out how big your bank is, and by running electricity through a shunt, it gives you a percentage or hours or amp hours, kilowatt hours, all that stuff, watts left available. And then I also got a 7-inch display, and I got to tell you, if you're going this way, I was torn whether I should do the 5-inch display or the 7. I splurged on the 7, and it's only like $50 or $100 more, but I highly recommend that you do the 7-inch display if you don't do the... And quite frankly, you can get all this information on your phone. You don't need to have this display at all, but if you're like me and you've invested heavily in this system, you might as well have a good means of entering data in and out without hooking up your laptop or going through your phone. And the 7-inch display is definitely the way to do it. So we've talked about the Multiplus, then there's the MP3 charge controllers, and they are also Bluetooth driven, and they also are connected to everything with their Victron Connect, I think that's what they call it, their proprietary network. because the batteries I use don't have cold weather protection. In other words, lithium batteries don't like to be charged below freezing. A lot of the newer ones will have BMS, or the battery management system, will automatically shut the battery off and not allow it to be charged when it reaches close to freezing temperatures. But mine don't have that, and that shouldn't be a problem because I plan to keep Paquita in the tropics. But just to be on the safe side, I got this Victron Battery Sense, which is just a little $50 thing. I think it's $46 or something like that. And you put it in the system, and it shuts the system down at any temperature you want. And to be on the safe side, I think I put mine at like 41 degrees or something like that. And so I'm just being very conservative with mine, but that's what that is. Then if you also look, you'll see here is a what they call a battery to battery charger. And I often see these installed on other people's YouTube channels, what I would call backwards. I don't know that it's backwards. It's just that many people get their information from van life things, from YouTube channels dealing with van life, where people drive around in a van. Well, that's a little bit different than on a boat. And so if you have Paquita has a 170 amp alternator, why would I have that charge my starting battery and then use a 20 or 30 amp battery to battery charger to charge my 900 amp hour lithium bank? That's just ridiculous. So I think that the proper way to do this, I'm not alone in this, but is to use your big charging sources to charge the big bank, which would be the house bank, and then use this battery to battery charger to charge the starting battery. And the starting battery it's still an AGM battery, or lead acid. And so you can't just charge it. Some people will put a something that will split, it charges two battery banks at the same time. The problem with that is that if you have a lithium bank and you have a lead acid or AGM bank, they both have different charging profiles. And this way you can set the profile to do it automatically, and it senses when the engine starts and it starts charging the battery then, and it works very well. That's what that is. And then the last thing that I have up here is the Victron Servo. And the Servo really is a communication hub. And there is another thing that I didn't think I was going to need because I have the Starlink. And I still don't need it. But boy, do I wish that I had it now, because I have everything shut down. The boat's on the hard right now. But there's a thing called Global GX, I think it's called, and for basically $400, it looks just like the Servo GX, but it has a SIM card in it, and it'll work anywhere in the world for I think 3 or maybe 4 years. So and it transmits all kinds of data. So anyway, we have this hooked up so that you can remotely monitor things anywhere there's assuming that it has an internet connection. And when the boat's in the water, the Starlink is active all the time. You'll be able, anywhere in the world that has an internet connection, you'll be able to see all the status of your batteries. But you can also see other things too, like temperatures, humidity. We have ours set so I can see the freezer temperature, the refrigerator temperature, humidities down below. I can also see whether how many times the bilge pump has come on, and how warm the water is in the water tank. That's another thing that it picks up. And then I have it turn a fan on and off to cool the Multiplus inverter. I put that in a confined space, which was really dumb of me. So as it only heats up when we're charging with the generator, but when it starts charging a lot, I think when it gets to about 95 degrees, the temperature sensor sends something to the servo, and the servo clicks a relay, and the fan starts blowing cold air in there, and you can do all that through that. But the servo, what it really does is it ties everything together, puts everything in one thing, and you can see the data everywhere. And you can see stuff off to the in the remote monitoring section. Now, just like if you have a smart home, if you have all this stuff, you might as well have a smart boat too. And that's kind of what you get when you tie it all together like this. And obviously there's a lot of people that were just happy with a tiller boat with a without any electronics on it, and that's fine. Look, you do whatever you do, that's fine. There are others of us that embrace technology. People are going to say, well, these things fail. Yep, everything fails, and boats sink. And if we were going to be really safe, we wouldn't leave the harbor. But there are some of us that embrace technology and believe it adds to our safety. And anyway, when you have all this stuff and you have it all talking to itself, you can also connect it to the internet, in my case via Starlink, or you could do it with the Global GX, and be able to monitor this stuff, and you archive data too. So you can start to see, well, you know what, when we were in this part of the world, we really could have benefited from using more solar. Or you know what, we have plenty of generation, but we don't have enough storage. We need to up our storage. Or you know what, where when you go through the archival data, that's this stuff logs for you. And by the way, it's all free too. It's not free to buy it. You have to buy it, but once you buy it, you're not paying a subscription. And there's a lot of companies that will do this sort of data logging for you, but they do it at about $150 to $200 a month. This is absolutely free. It's done for you anyway. So you might be able to say, you know what, we're doing this, but we're running our motor more than we thought, so it would have justified, it makes more sense to invest in a bigger alternator and then having to do the serpentine pulley and that sort of stuff. So having a way to monitor things is great when you're remote, but it also gives you a chance to really go through and drill down deep into the data and have the data drive you in the direction that you're going. So, problems and solutions. One thing that all the naysayers will definitely talk about is how if you don't set up your system correctly, you run the risk of blowing up your alternator. In the case of a 170 amp alternator, that's about a $2,000 mistake. But a lot of it is driven because they don't really understand what's happening. And you don't really blow up the alternator like that. What they're talking about is a transient spike. And that really can result in blowing up diodes in your alternator, which makes your alternator not work, but you don't have to replace the whole alternator. But for me, I would rather not have anything go wrong. So I was able to use, right from Balmar themselves, a transient spike arrestor. And that's this little wire. And basically what happens is, because there is no absorption or float in the charging profile for lithium, it basically bulks all the way until it gets to its full, and then once the BMSs say, okay, we're full, the BMSs will shut off and they will stop the charging. So if your alternator is putting out 150, 170 amps, and all of a sudden it goes to zero, there's a good chance that you're going to have a spike come back. And what will happen with this transient spike arrestor, it just basically just kind of shorts that out and keeps your diodes from being blown up. But the odd thing is that's never really happened on our system. First of all, having 3 batteries, the odds of 3 BMSs all tripping out exactly at the exact millisecond are very, very low. But they're high enough to justify me putting this transient spike arrestor in. Then the other thing is that I've adjusted my external regulator so that the regulator starts backing down as it gets, when it starts getting up there, it starts reducing anyway. So it hasn't been an issue for us, but that's one of the ways that we deal with this. Some people say, oh, you should always charge to an AGM battery. And once again, that's, you're just kind of, chasing the dog at that point. We have a big charging system to charge a big bank. That's what you should do, and then have the protections in place. We've done that, and it's worked wonderfully for us. It should come as no surprise at a project this big that mistakes were made. When I measured, I was ecstatic because I measured the inside of the battery box, and they could exactly fit 3 of these great big 300 amp hour batteries. But the mistake I made was that the corners of them were rounded, And so when I measured fore and aft, there was enough room to put the batteries in. But I didn't realize that I'd never be able to get the batteries up into the corners because the corners were rounded off on the inside because I couldn't see it. So I ended up having to cut some of the pieces out, and that wasn't that big a deal. It's underneath the settee. And if I had to, I could even make brackets to put them back, but I'm not worried about it. I did it so that you could kind of put one battery in, slide it into place, put another battery in, slide that into place. Then we had to put blocks in place to hold it so that, to make it code, they have to be strapped down as well. So then I had to put the third battery up into that confined space where the Multiplus is, and that's one of my concerns for getting that area hot. So that's something that I was dealing with. But then after I got the system all done, I went and everything's finally done. I go to switch it on, and the whole power in the boat goes out. I was convinced. I was like, oh my God, I don't know what I've done, but I must have blown something up. When it turns out that over 20 years of the negative, there's a big 1-aught wire, maybe 2-aught wire that goes up to the back of the panel, to the negative bus bar, and over 20 some years of opening and closing it, it had flexed. And after I did this big project and after everything got done, just at that moment when I was turning it on, that's what happened. You could see it broken off here. And so luckily when I found that, I was able to put another one on and it worked. But anyway, that's how I did our system. We love our system. It was worth every penny we've done. And everyone said I put way too much, 900 amp hours is way too much. Quite frankly, I got to say that I'm on the fence. I might actually take the inverter out of the confined space and put it outside where it really needs to be anyway. And freeing up that room would allow me to put one more battery in, so I'd have 1200 amp hours in there. I have to run some more numbers to make sure that's all right, but apparently, unlike with lead acid where you want to put them in all at the same time, you do have a much larger window of opportunity to size your system, in other words, to add more. So maybe that's something that we'll be doing, but it's been wonderful. All in all, the system was not that expensive. At the time, I think I spent about $1,000 a battery, and right now I think they're down to $800 for each one of these batteries. And if you wonder why I went with a Chinese clone and not one of the more regular ones, it was because if you're a fan of Will Prowse, he's an electrical engineer that I follow on YouTube a lot, and he couldn't find anything that he didn't like about these batteries. So if it's good enough for Will, they're good enough for me, and I've been really happy with them. And so hopefully they'll be good for another 10 or 20 years, but we'll see how. And all that's kind of silly anyway, because in 10 or 20 years from now, we'll probably have different technologies and different needs and all that sort of stuff. So who knows? We'll be running a nuclear reactor on board by then. I don't know. But you guys, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Be safe, take care, and as always, I'll see you guys on the one.